The dog saw her first. That was the thing nobody talked about afterward, not in the incident report, not in the administrator's carefully worded email to the board, not in any of the conversations that followed. But Joanna Trask remembered it clearly. The shepherd mix, big, black-saddled, with ears that moved like radar dishes, had been watching the door to room 114 for the better part of 2 hours when she came on shift. His handler hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, hadn't looked at anyone, but the dog had looked at her the moment she stepped into the hallway, and something about the quality of that attention made her slow down without knowing why. His name was Colt Maddigan, 51 years old. Former Army Ranger, 3 tours, retired after a training accident left him with a rebuilt left knee and a titanium rod in his forearm. He'd been admitted 6 days ago through the ER after a neighbor called 911 when she heard him screaming in his sleep, 3 nights in a row, loud enough to wake the whole floor of his apartment building. He'd come in cooperative, or at least not combative, which was how his intake nurse had phrased it. He'd sat in triage with the dog pressed against his left leg and answered the questions in a flat, measured voice. He gave them everything they needed: name, date of birth, insurance information, next of kin. A sister in Boise he hadn't spoken to in 4 years. What he didn't give them was eye contact. Not once. The dog's name was Sergeant. Joanna learned that from the whiteboard outside his room where the previous shift had written it in parentheses next to Maddigan's name, like a second patient. She appreciated whoever had done that. It told her something. She knocked twice before entering, which she did with everyone, though not everyone noticed. Maddigan noticed. His eyes moved to the door before she'd even finished the second knock, and his right hand shifted, just slightly, just an inch, toward the nightstand. There was nothing on the nightstand except a water cup and a paperback with a broken spine, but the movement was automatic. The kind of movement that had once meant something very different. Sergeant stood up. Joanna stopped in the doorway and held still. "Good morning," she said. "I'm Trask. I'm taking over from night shift." She didn't say "I'm your nurse" the way she normally would have. She wasn't sure why. It just didn't seem like the right opening. Maddigan looked at her for exactly 3 seconds. Then he looked away. "Fine," he said. She stayed in the doorway. "Can I come in to check your vitals? I'll be quick." He gave a single nod. Not at her, at the dog. Sergeant sat back down. She came in and did what she needed to do without chattering, without filling the silence with pleasantries, without asking how he'd slept. She checked his blood pressure, made a note of the reading, checked the IV line in his right arm, confirmed the drip rate. He watched the wall the entire time. Sergeant watched her. When she was done, she stepped back. "Do you need anything before I go?" "No." She was almost to the door when she heard him say quietly, "They're going to try to move him today." She turned around. He was still looking at the wall. "Sergeant," he said. "The floor manager was in here last night. Said they don't have documentation for an emotional support animal in a psych unit. Said he'd have to go to the kennel on level 2. Joanna felt something tighten behind her sternum. "Who told you that?" "Night manager, Paulson." He still wasn't looking at her. He was polite about it. Very professional. A pause. Didn't change what he said. She kept her face neutral. "I'll look into it." He turned then, just his head, and looked at her with the full weight of whatever was behind his eyes. It wasn't hostility, exactly. It was something older than that. The expression of a man who had been promised things before. "Sure," he said. "You do that." Joanna had worked the behavioral health unit at Callaway Regional for 6 years. She'd seen things go wrong in the way hospitals often went wrong, not through cruelty, exactly, but through a kind of institutional inertia, a slow accretion of policies and shortcuts and unspoken rules that hardened over time into something that looked a lot like cruelty from the inside. She wasn't naive about it, but she also believed, and had always believed, that the difference between a ward that worked and a ward that didn't came down to the nurses. Not the administrators. Not the attending physicians who appeared twice a day for 12 minutes and wrote orders from down the hall. The nurses. She went to the nurses' station and pulled Maddigan's file. She read it twice. Then she read the admissions protocol for service animals. There was, in fact, documentation. It was on page 4 of his intake paperwork. A certification from a licensed organization, issued 2 years ago, registering Sergeant as a psychiatric service dog under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Maddigan had brought the paperwork with him. It had been scanned into the system at intake. It was sitting right there in his file, and it had apparently been there for 6 days while nobody from management had bothered to look at it. She sat with that for a moment. Then she went to find Deb Paulson. The night manager was still finishing his shift handoff in the break room when Joanna walked in. Paulson was a big man, silver-haired, with the manner of someone who had once been empathetic and had slowly run out of the capacity for it somewhere around year 15 of the job. He wasn't a bad person. Joanna had worked with him long enough to know that. He was just tired in a way that had calcified. "The Maddigan patient," Joanna said. "He told me you spoke to him last night about his dog." Paulson poured himself coffee without looking up. "I did. We don't have a protocol for animals in psych. Risk management has been on us about it. There's ADAD documentation in his file. Page 4. It was there at intake." A pause. "What kind of documentation?" "Service animal certification. Psychiatric. Issued by a licensed organization in his name, covering Sergeant specifically." She waited. "It's not an emotional support animal. It's a task-trained psychiatric service dog. Different legal category. Under federal law, we're required to accommodate him in any area of the hospital where the patient is allowed to be." Paulson set his coffee down and looked at her for the first time. Something moved across his face, not guilt exactly, more like the look of a man recalculating. "Risk management, Paulson." She kept her voice even. "He's a ranger. 3 tours. He came in voluntarily. He's been cooperative for 6 days. Sergeant is the primary reason he came in at all. That dog is the only reason he agreed to treatment. If you put Sergeant on level 2, Maddigan will AMA by noon, against medical advice." The 3 letters that meant the hospital had failed. Paulson picked up his coffee again. He turned toward the window. Outside, the morning was gray and still, the kind of early fall sky that couldn't decide whether to rain. "I'll talk to Dr. Reinhold," he said finally. "I'd appreciate that." She turned to go, then stopped. "And in the meantime, nobody moves that dog." She felt his eyes on her back as she walked out. Dr. Reinhold was the attending psychiatrist on the unit. He was 44, very precise, with the kind of academic confidence that occasionally collapsed into arrogance without him noticing the transition. He was also, in Joanna's experience, fundamentally reasonable if you caught him at the right moment and came with documentation. She caught him at the right moment. She came with documentation. He read the certification twice, which she took as a good sign. "All right," he said, "the dog stays." He looked up. "Do we have notes in here about the handler's response to the animal?" "Any observed incidents of—" "Nothing negative," Joanna said. "Sergeant alerts when Maddigan's distress levels rise, places himself against his handler's left side during agitation. He's prevented 2 incidents in the first 72 hours, according to night shift notes." Reinhold was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the file with the expression of a man who was beginning to realize he hadn't been paying close enough attention. "The unit manager told me this was a non-issue," he said. "There may have been a miscommunication about the documentation," Joanna said, which was the most diplomatic thing she could think of. He closed the file. "The dog stays. I'll note it in the chart." "Thank you, Dr. Reinhold." She went back to the hallway. She stood there for a moment, breathing slowly, feeling the adrenaline drain from her hands. Then she went back to room 114. She knocked twice, waited, went in. Maddigan was in the same position. Sergeant was at his feet. The water cup hadn't moved. "Sergeant stays," she said. Maddigan didn't look at her, but his right hand moved just slightly and rested on the dog's back. Sergeant's tail swept the floor once. "Okay," Maddigan said. It wasn't gratitude exactly, but it wasn't nothing. The week that followed was quiet in the way that quiet on a behavioral health unit was always provisional. Things held until they didn't. Joanna kept coming in for her shifts, kept knocking twice, kept doing what needed to be done without making a performance of it. Maddigan kept not talking much, kept watching walls, kept his hand on Sergeant whenever he thought no one was looking. He started eating more on day 9. She noticed that. On day 11, he asked her a question, not about his medications or his treatment plan or his discharge date. He asked her whether the cafeteria on the 2nd floor was still serving the chicken soup or whether they'd switched to something else. She told him they still had it. "That's something," he said. On day 12, a new patient was admitted 2 rooms down. A 23-year-old named Cassidy Brewer, recent Army separation, 3 months out of Fort Bragg and clearly struggling. She was thin in a way that wasn't healthy, with the eyes of someone who had been keeping herself awake on purpose. She came in reluctantly, accompanied by an older woman who Joanna assumed was her mother until the woman said she was a veteran services counselor. Cassidy refused to talk to the social worker, refused to talk to the intake nurse, sat in the corner of her room with her arms around her knees and didn't respond when people spoke to her. Joanna checked on her twice during the morning, same as everyone else. Got nothing. At noon, she was walking past room 114 when she heard voices. Or rather, she heard one voice, low and measured, and then nothing. Then the voice again. She stopped. Maddigan was sitting in the open doorway of his room. Sargent was beside him. Cassidy Brewer was standing in the hallway about 6 feet away, looking at the dog with an expression Joanna couldn't quite read. "He won't jump," Maddigan said. "He doesn't jump on people. You can come closer." Cassidy didn't move. "What's his name?" she said. Her voice was rough, like she hadn't used it in a while. "Sargent." A long pause. "My canine handler at Bragg had a dog named Zeus," she said. "He was a Belgian Mal. Stupidest-looking ears you've ever seen, but that dog could find a cell phone in a shipping container." Maddigan looked at her. "Sargent's got a cousin like that. Different handler now, still working." Something shifted in Cassidy's face. Not much. Barely anything. But Joanna saw it from where she was standing. She kept walking. On day 14, Joanna arrived to find a memo on the unit manager's desk addressed to the attending physicians and nursing staff, CC'd to risk management, HR, and the hospital's legal team. It was from the new unit director, a man named Forsyth who had arrived 6 weeks ago from a corporate healthcare consulting firm and had spent most of his time since then rearranging the break room furniture and scheduling all staff meetings that accomplished nothing. The memo was titled Protocol Clarification, Non-Medical Animals in Behavioral Health. It was 4 paragraphs long. The first 2 paragraphs explained that the hospital was reviewing its service animal policy in response to recent ambiguity. The third paragraph said that pending the conclusion of the review, all service animal accommodations required sign-off from unit administration in addition to physician authorization. The fourth paragraph said the review would take approximately 30 days. Joanna read it twice. Then she read it a third time, slowly, because sometimes things meant exactly what they appeared to mean, and it was important not to give them more credit than they deserved. She put the memo down. She went to find Annalisa Odom, who was the unit's charge nurse, and had been doing the job for 11 years and knew where every body was buried, figuratively speaking. "Forsyth's memo," Joanna said. Odom didn't look up from her charting. "I saw it. He's requiring admin sign-off on service animal accommodations. That's a 30-day review process. I know. Maddigan's certification was already cleared by Dr. Reinhold. This memo is retroactive. I know that too." Odom set her pen down and looked at Joanna with the particular expression of a woman who had seen this exact situation before. "He doesn't like that the dog issue got escalated over his head last week. He wants to make clear who runs this unit by putting a veterans treatment plan in jeopardy, by establishing administrative authority. The Veterans Treatment Plan is incidental." Odom folded her hands. "What are you going to do?" Joanna thought about that for a moment. She thought about Maddigan sitting in the doorway of his room, talking to a 23-year-old who hadn't spoken to anyone in 48 hours. She thought about Cassidy Brewer's face when she heard the dog's name. "I'm going to document everything," she said. She started that afternoon. She pulled every piece of paperwork that touched Sargent's presence in the unit. She flagged the ADA certification in Maddigan's file, made copies, put the date and time on each one. She wrote detailed nursing notes for each of her interactions with Maddigan, noting, in clinical, measured language, his affect before and after Sargent's presence, his engagement with treatment activities, his food intake, his sleep hours, as reported on the night shift log. She noted the incident on day 12 in the hallway with Cassidy Brewer. She was careful and precise about it, the way she had been taught to be precise, because imprecision was the thing that got used against you. She also called the hospital's patient advocacy office. The person who answered was named Terry Wills. She had a voice that suggested she spent most of her day on hold. "I need to know the hospital's procedure for ADA accommodation disputes in inpatient psychiatric units," Joanna said. A pause. "Are you a patient?" "I'm a nurse on the behavioral health unit. I have a patient with a service animal whose accommodation has been cleared by the attending physician and is supported by federal certification, and the new unit director has issued a memo requiring a 30-day administrative review of all service animal cases. I want to understand the legal exposure. A longer pause. I'll transfer you to compliance, Terry Wills said. Compliance was a man named Otis Berryman who turned out to be extremely helpful in the way that people in compliance departments were extremely helpful when they suddenly sensed liability. He walked her through the ADA language. He explained the hospital's obligations under Title II and Title III. He used the phrase significant legal risk 4 times in 20 minutes. So to be clear, Joanna said, if the hospital's administrative review process effectively delays or denies an accommodation that's already been established under federal law, that's a problem, Berryman said, which was the compliance department's way of saying, yes, very much so. She thanked him and went back to the floor. On day 16, Forsyth called her into his office. He was a trim man in his mid-50s, with the posture of someone who had been told since childhood that posture was important. He had the memo on his desk. He had her nursing notes in front of him. He did not look happy. Trask, he said. Sit down. She sat. I want to talk to you about your notes regarding the Maddigan patient. All right. There are some members of the nursing staff who feel that your documentation has been. He searched for the word. Pointed. I document what I observe, she said. You documented 14 instances of therapeutic benefit attributable to the service animal over a 9-day period. Yes, because there were 14 instances. Forsyth leaned back slightly. I understand you also contacted the compliance office. I had procedural questions. I went to the appropriate department. He looked at her for a long moment. She met his gaze without blinking, which she had learned to do a long time ago. The review process exists for a reason, he said. We have liability concerns. We have other patients on this unit who may have allergies or phobias or... There's been no complaint from any other patient, she said. I checked. She let that sit for a moment. Sergeant is a trained psychiatric service animal covered under federal law. Dr. Reinhold authorized his presence on day 7. We have documentation of his therapeutic impact in the patient's nursing notes and in the physician's progress notes. The 30-day review creates an administrative delay on an accommodation that's already been legally established. Forsyth's jaw tightened. I'm going to ask you, he said very evenly, to let the review process work. And I'm going to ask you, she said just as evenly, to consider what happens if Mr. Maddigan against medical advice during that 30-day window. He came in voluntarily. He can leave voluntarily. He's been improving. If the review creates uncertainty about his treatment plan, he may decide the uncertainty isn't worth it. She paused. That outcome would not look good in the documentation. The silence stretched. I'm noting, Forsyth said finally, that you have concerns about the timeline. I do. I'll take that under advisement. He picked up her nursing notes. That will be all, Trask. She stood up. She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame. He hasn't slept more than 3 consecutive hours in 3 years, she said. His last 2 nights, according to the sleep log, he's been getting 5. I just thought that was worth saying. She left before he could respond. The review didn't take 30 days. It took 11. She didn't know exactly what happened in those 11 days. What calls were made, which emails were sent, whether Otis Berryman had conversations with anyone above Forsyth's pay grade. She knew that on day 11, Forsyth issued a follow-up memo that said the review had been completed and the hospital's policy had been clarified to align with federal ADA requirements. He used the phrase enhanced documentation standards 4 times and never mentioned the previous memo at all. She saved both memos. She kept them in a folder with everything else. On the afternoon of the same day, she was doing her late-round checks when she passed room 114 and heard something she hadn't heard before. She stopped. It was quiet. Not the silence Maddigan usually kept, not the held-in, careful silence of a man bracing against something invisible. This was different. The room was still, and through the half-open door she could see him sitting in the chair by the window, not looking at anything in particular, with Sergeant's head on his knee and his hand resting on the dog's ears. The afternoon light came in flat and gray through the blinds. He looked tired. He looked like a person. He looked like someone who had, for the moment, put something down. She kept walking. He was discharged 3 days later. Dr. Reinhold had arranged a follow-up plan, outpatient therapy, a VA-affiliated counselor who had experience with combat veterans, a peer support group that met on Tuesday evenings at a church hall in the county. The kind of aftercare plan that sometimes got followed and sometimes didn't, but that represented the best available map for a road that nobody else could walk for you. Maddigan came to the nurse's station before he left. He had Sergeant on a lead, the dog's vest on, his duffel bag over one shoulder. He looked smaller outside the room, somehow the way people sometimes did when you'd only ever seen them horizontal. He stopped at the station. He looked at Joanna. "Trask," he said. "Maddigan," she said. He didn't say thank you. She hadn't expected him to. He just looked at her for a moment with those steady, careful eyes, and then he gave a single nod, the kind that meant something, not the kind that was just politeness. She nodded back. He walked down the hallway. Sergeant's nails clicked on the linoleum. At the elevator, the dog looked back at her once, the way dogs sometimes do, checking, and then the doors slid open and they were gone. What happened after that, she learned in pieces. She heard from a colleague at the VA outpatient center that Maddigan had shown up to every appointment for the first 2 months, which was more than most. She heard, through a chain of people she barely knew, that he had started volunteering with a veterans peer support organization, not leading anything, just showing up, just being in the room. She heard that Cassidy Brewer was discharged 4 days after Maddigan, that her mother had come to take her home, that she'd requested a specific outpatient therapist by name on her discharge paperwork, a woman who specialized in military trauma. She heard that Forsyth was no longer the unit director by the end of the year. She heard it from Odom, matter-of-factly, on a Tuesday morning over bad coffee in the break room. Compliance audit, Odom said. The Maddigan case was one of several flagged. There were others. The documentation hadn't been great on animal accommodations going back 18 months. Joanna looked at her coffee. "Is that right?" "That's right." Odom stirred her own cup. "Your notes, by the way, were described as..." She looked up, and the corner of her mouth moved, unusually thorough. Joanna didn't say anything. She thought about a dog looking back from an elevator, about a hallway at noon, about Cassidy Brewer saying stupidest-looking ears you've ever seen in a voice that had begun, just barely, to sound like something might still be possible. "Someone had to document it," she said. Odom nodded. She didn't make a bigger thing of it than that, which was why Joanna had always respected her. They finished their coffee. The morning shift started. Down the hall, the unit moved through its quiet, difficult rhythms. People in rooms with their particular weights, nurses moving between them, the unremarkable daily work of holding things together when they threatened to come apart. Joanna tied her hair back and picked up the first chart of the day. She had always believed the difference came down to the nurses. Not the administrators, not the policy memos, not the forms in triplicate that went into files that went into systems. The nurses, the ones who knocked twice and came in slow and noticed which direction a man's hand moved when he heard the door. She didn't think about it in those terms while she was doing it. She was just doing the job. But sometimes, on the right kind of morning, that was exactly what it felt like to do it right.